Ever wondered how much money you can actually stash in your Monzo account? It's a question I get asked a lot, and it's a pretty important one, especially if you're thinking about using Monzo for anything beyond your daily coffee run. Maybe you're planning a big purchase, receiving a hefty sum, or just trying to consolidate your finances. Whatever the reason, knowing the limits of your Monzo account is crucial. So, let's dive in and unravel this mystery. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty numbers, it's important to understand that Monzo, like most financial institutions, has certain limits in place. These limits aren't there to annoy you, but rather to protect both you and the bank from fraud, money laundering, and other financial nasties. Think of them as guardrails on a highway. They might seem restrictive, but they're ultimately there for your safety. We need to break this down into a few key areas because the answer isn't a single, simple number. It's more nuanced than that. We're going to look at daily limits, weekly limits, annual limits, and also consider different ways you might be transferring money, because that can also impact how much you can send or receive. Let's start with incoming transfers. This is probably what most people are curious about. How much can someone send to your Monzo account? The good news is that for most everyday transactions, you're unlikely to hit a limit. Monzo doesn't impose strict daily or weekly limits on incoming bank transfers in the vast majority of cases. So, if your friend is sending you £50 for dinner, or your employer is paying your monthly salary, you shouldn't encounter any problems. However, there are some caveats. Very large sums of money, we're talking tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of pounds, might trigger additional checks. This isn't a hard limit, but rather a security measure. Monzo, like all banks, has a responsibility to verify the source of large funds to comply with anti-money laundering regulations. So, if you're expecting a significant inheritance or the proceeds from a house sale, be prepared to provide some documentation to explain the origin of the funds. This is a standard procedure, and it's nothing to worry about as long as everything is legitimate. Now, what about outgoing transfers? How much can you send from your Monzo account? This is where things get a little more specific. Monzo does have limits on how much you can send in a single transaction, as well as daily and weekly limits. These limits vary depending on your account type and how you're making the transfer. For standard bank transfers within the UK, the limits are generally quite generous. You can typically send several £1,000s in a single transaction, and the daily and weekly limits are also reasonably high. However, it's always a good idea to check the specific limits in your Monzo app, as they can be subject to change. One thing to keep in mind is that these limits apply to bank transfers. If you're using other methods to send money, such as paying with your Monzo debit card, different limits might apply. For card payments, the limits are typically lower than for bank transfers, and they're designed to protect you from fraud if your card is lost or stolen. Another factor that can affect your transfer limits is the type of account you have. Monzo offers different account tiers, and some accounts might have higher limits than others. If you're a business customer, for example, you might have access to higher transfer limits than a personal account holder. Now, let's talk about international transfers. Sending money abroad can be a bit more complicated, and the limits can vary significantly depending on the destination country and the currency you're sending. Monzo partners with Wise, formerly TransferWise, for international transfers, and they have their own set of limits and fees. It's crucial to check the Wise website or your Monzo app for the specific limits and fees that apply to your chosen destination. One common question is whether there's a limit to how much money you can hold in your Monzo account overall. The answer is yes, there is a limit. However, for most individuals, this limit is so high that it's unlikely to be a concern. It's in the hundreds of thousands of pounds, so unless you're planning on storing a fortune in your Monzo account, you probably won't need to worry about hitting this limit. So, to summarize, there's no single magic number for how much you can transfer into a Monzo account. Incoming transfers are generally quite flexible, with no hard daily or weekly limits for most transactions. However, very large sums might trigger additional security checks. Outgoing transfers have specific limits that vary depending on the transfer method, the destination, and your account type. It's always best to check the specific limits in your Monzo app to avoid any surprises. Remember, these limits are in place for your protection and the security of the banking system. While they might seem inconvenient at times, they're a necessary part of ensuring that your money is safe and that financial transactions are conducted responsibly. If you have any concerns about your transfer limits, or if you need to make a particularly large transfer, it's always a good idea to contact Monzo customer support. They can provide you with personalized advice and help you navigate any potential issues. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.